My brother changed the locks on our father's house 6 days after Dad died, and when I stood on the porch with the key that had worked that morning, he opened the door just wide enough to tell me the house was his now, and that I should leave. I want you to understand where I was standing when he said it. That porch, the one where I'd sat with my father almost every evening for 10 years. The one where I'd set his oxygen tank when the stairs got to be too much, where I'd read him the paper because his eyes had gone, where I'd held his hand through the long summer he was afraid to fall asleep in case he didn't wake up. I knew that porch better than I knew my own kitchen. And there I was, with a key that no longer turned, looking at my younger brother Greg, who was wearing a pressed jacket and holding a folded piece of paper like a shield. Marianne, he said. He only ever calls me Marianne when he's performing. I know this is hard, but the will is clear. The house comes to me. I've spoken to a lawyer, and honestly, it's cleaner if you just take your things and go. There's no point dragging this out. The house comes to me. As if Greg had spent a single night of the last decade under that roof. As if he hadn't shown up to exactly 2 of Dad's 41 hospital visits, both times for under an hour, both times checking his watch. As if the man who'd changed the locks while I was at the funeral home arranging the flowers had any right to say the word clean. And I did not scream. I did not cry. Though God knows I had every reason to. Standing there with a dead father, and a locked door. I did not argue about the will. I looked at my brother for a long moment, and then I nodded. Once, and I said 2 words. Once. All right. Greg looked relieved. He actually softened, the way he does when he thinks he's gotten away with something, and he said, I'm glad you're being reasonable. And I let him think it, because what Greg didn't know, what he had never once thought to check, because he decided long ago that his sister was just the one who stayed home and wiped chins and didn't understand anything more complicated than a casserole, was that our father had known exactly who Greg was. And Dad had done something about it. Something quiet. Something he'd left for me in the one place on earth Greg would never think to look. Then I remembered the workshop. But to understand why I nodded instead of breaking, and why I already knew, standing on that porch, that this was not going to end the way Greg thought. You have to go back. You have to understand what those 10 years actually were, and who I became inside them, and how a person gives everything to someone, and lets the world decide it was nothing. My name is Marianne Boyd. Everyone calls me Mare. I was 53 years old the week my brother locked me out of our father's house, and for most of my life I believed something that turned out not to be true. I believed that love was just something you did quietly. That if you truly loved someone, you didn't keep score, you didn't announce it, you didn't ask to be thanked, you just showed up, day after day, and the showing up was its own reward. I built 10 years of my life on that belief. It took me until I was 53, standing on a porch with a dead key in my hand, to understand that doing love quietly had taught the loud people in my family that my love didn't count. Our father was named Harold. Everyone called him Hank. He was a machinist for 38 years, a man who could fix anything with a motor and fix most things without one. And he built a workshop in the backyard of that house with his own hands, board by board. The year I was born, that workshop was the truest room he had. It smelled like sawdust and machine oil and the particular metal smell of a man who made things. When I was little, he'd let me sit on the stool and hand him tools, and he taught me their names before he taught me to ride a bike. My mother died when I was 42, and after that, it was just Dad in that house getting older. Greg had moved 3 states away for a job he liked to describe as important, and he called on Sundays for exactly the length of a Sunday phone call. And when Dad's heart started to fail, and then his eyes, and then his balance, it was never a question who would step in. I lived 20 minutes away. I was divorced, my own kids grown and gone. So I came. I want to be honest, because I made mistakes too, and this story isn't worth telling if I'm not honest about them. I never asked Greg for help, not really. I told myself he was busy, that his work mattered, that it wasn't fair to pull him away from his life. I told myself I was the one who was good at this, that Dad was more comfortable with me, that it was simpler if I just handled it. Every time I made an excuse for my brother, I taught him, and I taught myself that my time was worth less than his. Kindness without a boundary isn't kindness. It's a bill you keep paying so no one else has to. It started as a few days a week, groceries, doctor's appointments, keeping the house up, then it was every day. Then it was most nights, because he got scared alone in the dark. I cut back my hours at work. And then I left my job entirely, because you cannot hold down a paycheck and turn a grown man in his bed at 3 in the morning so he doesn't get bed sores. I spent down my own savings. I let my own life go quiet and small, and I did not resent it because I loved him, and because the showing up was its own reward. That's what I told myself. For 10 years. And Greg? Greg made appearances. He'd fly in for a holiday, breeze through the door with a big gift and a bigger story, spend an afternoon being the beloved son, take a photo holding Dad's hand, and fly back out. He was very good at the photo. He'd post it and people would tell him what a wonderful son he was. Meanwhile, I'd be in the next room boiling the syringes and sorting the pills into the days of the week. Nobody took a photo of that. That's not a complaint. It's just the truth of how it looked from the outside, and how little the outside knew. Here is the part I need you to hold on to, because it's the whole story. About 3 years before Dad died, on a good afternoon when his mind was clear and strong, he asked me to drive him somewhere and wouldn't tell me where. It turned out to be a lawyer's office in town. He made me wait in the car. He was in there almost 2 hours. When he came out, he had a large envelope, and he was quiet the whole way home, and all he said was, "Mare, if anything ever happens and things get complicated, you go out to the workshop. You look behind the pegboard where I keep the good chisels. You'll know what to do." I laughed and told him not to be morbid. He didn't laugh back. He just patted my knee and said, "Humor an old man, behind the pegboard." I forgot about it. Or I let myself forget, the way you do with things that sound like a dying man being dramatic. I had bed sores and syringes and oxygen tanks to think about. I didn't have room for envelopes. The last few months were the hardest of my life. Dad stopped being able to walk. He forgot my name for a while and then found it again. I slept in the chair beside his bed for the final 3 weeks, and on his last clear night, he squeezed my hand. His grip was still surprisingly strong, a machinist's grip, and he said, "You were the only one who stayed. Don't you ever let anybody tell you it didn't count." I thought he was just talking about the caregiving. I understand now he was talking about everything that was coming. He knew his son. He'd always known. The vulnerable moment shows you who's actually there and who's just visiting. Greg came for the very end. He made it for the last 2 days. And he cried the loudest at the funeral, and he hugged the most people, and he told everyone what a wonderful father Hank had been. And then, 6 days later, while I was still numb, he changed the locks. So let me take you back to that porch, to the moment after I nodded and said, "All right," because that nod was not surrender. It was a woman remembering something. Standing there with the key that wouldn't turn, in the middle of my grief, I heard my father's voice as clear as if he were beside me. "Behind the pegboard, Mare." And here is the thing Greg had overlooked in all his cleverness with the locks. He'd changed the locks on the house. He had not touched the workshop. Why would he? To Greg, the workshop was just a shed full of an old man's junk, dusty tools worth nothing, the last place on earth he'd bother with. He'd probably never set foot in it in his adult life. But that workshop had a separate padlock, and I had a key to it. I'd had a key to it since I was a girl, and Greg had never once thought to ask for it, because it never occurred to him that the shed held anything but sawdust. So that night, after Greg drove off satisfied, I walked around the side of the house in the dark, and I opened the workshop, and I turned on the single light, and I stood for a moment in the smell of my father's sawdust and oil and metal. And then I went to the pegboard where he kept the good chisels, and I lifted it off its hooks. Taped to the back of it was the large envelope. Inside that envelope was everything. I sat down on my father's stool and I read it all, twice, and my hands went very still. Because here is what Hank Boyd had done in that lawyer's office 3 years before he died, on a good clear afternoon, of entirely sound mind, with a witness and a notary. He had not left the house to Greg. In some old will Greg was now waving around. He had done something far more careful than a will. He had signed and recorded, actually recorded, at the county recorder of deeds, a transfer of the house into a form that passed it directly to me, his caregiver daughter, outside of probate, the moment he died. It was already, legally, done. The house had become mine the day my father stopped breathing. The will Greg had spoken to a lawyer about was an old one, superseded, worth about as much as the paper it was printed on. And there was more. There was a letter, in Dad's own careful hand, notarized, dated, explaining exactly why that Marianne had given up her career and her savings and 10 years of her life, that Greg had been absent by his own free choice, and that this was not punishment but simple justice, so that the one who stayed is not left with nothing by the one who left. My father had thought of everything. He'd even anticipated that Greg would fight, and had left instructions for his attorney. And there was one more thing, the thing that told me my father had truly known his son to the bone. There was a promissory note. 6 years earlier, Greg had borrowed a large sum from Dad for the down payment on his house, 3 states away, the one he'd never once invited Dad to visit. Greg had always treated it as a gift, a thing everyone had quietly forgotten. Dad had not forgotten. He'd had Greg sign for it. And that signed note was in the envelope, with the interest schedule my father had written out in pencil, the way a machinist measures twice. The next morning, I did the first thing I've done right in a long time. I did not call Greg and scream. I did not drive over and put my own key in the lock just to prove I could. Anger burns fast and clean and leaves you with nothing. I called the attorney whose name was on those documents, a kind, precise older man named Walter Prentice, who had been my father's lawyer, and who, it turned out, had been waiting for my call. When I told him what had happened with the locks, there was a silence on the line, and then he said the thing I've thought about every day since. He said, "Marianne, your father told me his son would do exactly this. He said, let the paperwork do the talking and let my daughter keep her dignity. So let's do that." So I did. Over the next 2 weeks, while Greg cheerfully arranged to list his house for sale, I gathered everything, calmly and completely. Certified copies of the recorded deed transfer, stamped by the county, the notarized letter, the signed promissory note. Walter drafted a simple, clear letter, laying out the legal reality. Not a weapon. The truth doesn't need to be a weapon. A record. And then I did what my father asked of me. I let the truth land clearly and calmly, in front of the right people, so it could never be twisted. I didn't ambush my brother. Walter arranged a meeting at his office and invited Greg to review the estate documents. Greg came thinking, I'm sure, that he was there to finalize his claim. He brought his own lawyer and his old will and that same confident jaw. I watched my brother's face change in real time. It's the one part of this whole story I'm not entirely proud of enjoying, and I won't pretend I felt nothing. Walter slid the certified deed across the table first. He explained, in his precise, gentle way, that the house had passed to me directly upon our father's death, outside the will, and that the transfer had been recorded at the county 3 years earlier and was beyond dispute. Greg's lawyer read it, and I watched him lean over and murmur something to Greg, and I watched the color leave my brother's face. That's not he wouldn't, Greg said. That house was supposed to be split. This is a trick. She manipulated him. She had him for 10 years, of course she got in his ear. And Walter, without raising his voice, slid the notarized letter across the table, in our father's own hand, explaining, in words no one could argue with, exactly why. And then, last, he slid across the promissory note and explained that the estate of which I was now the representative would be calling that loan due, with the interest our father had calculated in pencil, unless Greg preferred to discuss a different arrangement. The room went very quiet. It was not a triumphant silence. It was the silence of a man watching a story he'd told himself his whole life fall apart on a conference table. Greg did what people like Greg do. He got angry. He said I'd stolen his inheritance. He said Dad was confused. He said a great many things, and I let him say them, because Walter was noting it down, and because our cousin Denise was there as a witness. And every word made the truth of who my brother was clearer to everyone in the room. And when he finally ran out of breath, I spoke, and I did not raise my voice. Greg, I said, for 10 years, I never once asked you to help. I made your excuses for you. I told myself your life mattered more than mine. And when Dad died, you changed the locks on the house I nursed him in, and you told me to leave, and I nodded and I said all right. Because I have never wanted to fight you. I put my hand on the envelope. Dad knew you'd do this. He told his lawyer you would. He didn't leave me this house to punish you. He left it to me so that the one who stayed wouldn't be left with nothing by the one who left. Those are his words, not mine. I'm not going to destroy you, but you are going to give me back the keys to my house, and we are going to be honest for once about who did the work. Now, the consequences, and here is where I want to be careful, because this channel is not about revenge, and neither am I. I did not chase Greg for every last dollar of that loan. I could have. Walter advised me I'd win. But my father, for all his careful pencil measurements, had not raised me to be cruel, and I had watched enough grief curdle into war to want no part of it. I forgave a portion of the note, on the condition that Greg stop contesting what could not be contested and sign a final acknowledgement of the truth. He signed. He had no choice, and for once in his life, the paperwork made honesty the only option left. The house was mine, the workshop was mine. And the deepest consequence for Greg was not financial at all, it was that our whole extended family had now seen, in black and white, in our father's own hand, exactly who had stayed and who had not. No photo holding Dad's hand ever fixed that. He'd undone himself. Greed doesn't need an enemy, it just needs someone who assumes the quiet one won't check the pegboard. Not everyone stayed on the wrong side of it, because the aftermath is never as clean as we'd like. Our cousin Denise came to me after that meeting, and she cried, and she said, "We all let you carry him alone. We told ourselves you had it handled." I'm so sorry. I made her a cup of coffee. We sat for a long time. Some things can be mended, if the person is honest about the damage. Denise was. Greg and I have not spoken since he signed that paper. I've made my peace with that. Not every relationship is meant to be saved, and part of getting older is learning the difference between the ones worth mending and the ones worth setting down. I live in the house now, my house. I had the locks changed back to the ones my father chose, and I cleaned out the workshop, but I didn't empty it. I oiled his tools and I hung the good chisels back on the pegboard, and on Saturday mornings I go out there with my coffee and I sit on his stool in the smell of sawdust and oil, and I've started making things. Small things. A birdhouse, a stool of my own. My hands remember more than I expected. He taught me the names of the tools before he taught me to ride a bike, and it turns out that kind of teaching stays. The morning light comes through the one dusty window and lands on 38 years of a good man's work, and it is entirely mine now, and I've found I don't mind that at all. Here is what I know now, and it's the only thing I really came here to tell you. Showing up is the whole thing. Not the speech at the funeral, not the photo holding the hand, not the will waved on the porch. Love is the 10,000 ordinary days. Nobody takes a picture of the boiled syringes, the 3 a.m. turnings, the paper read aloud to eyes that can't see it anymore. For a long time I believed that doing that quietly, without keeping score, was the purest kind of love. And it was. But I learned something hard alongside it. Doing love quietly doesn't mean it leaves no record. My father kept the record for me, because he knew I never would. The quiet work always leaves a trace somewhere, in someone's memory, in a signed piece of paper taped behind a pegboard, in the simple, undeniable fact of who was in the room. And here's the other thing. Being used is not the same as being seen. My family used my love for 10 years and called it my nature, but my father saw it. He saw every day of it, even the days he couldn't say my name, and he made sure quietly, carefully, 3 years ahead of time that the one who stayed would not be left with nothing by the one who left. That was his last gift to me, not the house. The house was just wood and brick. His last gift was proof that it counted, proof that he'd seen. The people who underestimate you because you're the quiet one, the one who stayed home, the one who just took care of things, they are only writing, in advance, the story of their own surprise. So let me leave you with a question, because I read every single comment, and I want to know. If you had given 10 years of your life to someone, and the person who gave nothing locked you out the week they died and told you to leave, would you have nodded and said, "All right," and quietly checked the paperwork the way I did? Or would you have put your shoulder to that door right then and there? There's no wrong answer. I've made my peace with mine, but I'd truly like to hear yours. Tell me in the comments below. And if this story stayed with you, if you know what it is to be the one who stays while others take the credit, then stay with me. Because the next story I'm going to tell you is about a woman whose own siblings accused her of stealing from their mother's account, in front of the whole family. never once checking who had actually been putting money into it. What the bank statement showed left the room silent. Watch that one next. Subscribe to Aveline Justice. New stories every single day, and every one of them, like this one, is for anyone who ever did the quiet work and watched someone else take the bow. Because the truth, it always, always finds its way to the surface. I'm Mare. Thank you for sitting with me. I'll see you in the next one.